I always tried to act honestly with people, did not do any terrible things, and always helped everyone. Deep down, I believed that it would bear fruit and protect me from bad people. But I was wrong. I was sitting in my living room and watching a video recording of my wife cheating on me with my friend. It was a lot of pain. It was a chilly and overcast November day in Chicago, and I found myself standing in an empty lot. The cold, damp wind cut through me, chilling me to the core as I surveyed my surroundings. Charred pieces of wood, soot-stained drywall, and shards of broken glass littered the ground. Light debris danced across the lot, driven by the relentless wind. It struck me that this scene symbolized my life, a burnt-out shell of its former self, cold and bleak, a testament to loneliness, bitterness, and failure. I kicked a piece of concrete and continued to dwell on what, if anything, I could salvage from what remained. I met Olivia at a charity fundraiser a few weeks after my 29th birthday. At that time, I was effectively the second in command of our family's retail business. My great-uncle Seth, who was the main shareholder and CEO, instructed me to attend in order to represent our interests, make connections, and possibly generate some business. The event was incredibly dull, filled with overly dramatic, self-important individuals who seemed to equate raising a few $1,000s for a local library with the humanitarian efforts of Mother Teresa. I tried to be polite, nodding and smiling absent-mindedly, occasionally biting my tongue to avoid saying something regrettable, and desperately hoping for an opportunity to leave early. Just as I was contemplating my escape, she quietly slipped into the seat next to me. Olivia had a dazzling smile and began chatting as if we were old friends. She was graceful and elegant, with slender brown hair and bronze skin that exuded confidence. Conversation flowed effortlessly, and suddenly the fundraiser didn't seem so unbearable. Throughout school, work, and sports, I had always been driven and competitive, but social situations made me uneasy. Being married to my job since business school, coupled with my innate social awkwardness, made it even more challenging to navigate relationships, especially with women. I rarely approached women for dates unless we had known each other for a long time. However, Olivia was irresistible to me, and by the end of the evening I had mustered the courage to ask her out to dinner. To my relief, we hit it off immediately. Despite my initial apprehensions, we discovered we had many shared interests and plenty to talk about. I was quickly captivated by her, and it seemed the feeling was mutual. By the time I escorted her home that evening, it was clear that we would be spending a lot more time together. We dated for a couple of months as our romance gained momentum. Pretty soon we started dating several times a week and kissed on every date. I really liked her, and I was interested in developing our relationship physically, but I didn't dare risk being rejected or embarrassing her. However, one evening, Olivia made it clear to me that she thought I was moving too slowly. Instead of kissing me goodnight at her front door, she took matters into her own hands. Literally, she threw me on the bed. I was not inexperienced, but my meetings with women were limited. She showed me a level of passion that surpassed anything I had experienced before. By the time we finished, I was completely exhausted. At that time, it was the most exciting experience of my life. From then on, intimacy became regular and effortless as our relationship grew deeper. Within a few months, we moved in together, and just over a year after we first met, we were married. We settled into a charming, tree-lined neighborhood in a spacious 4-bedroom house, spruced up the landscaping, adopted a dog, and life was exceptionally fulfilling. Marriage suited me in nearly every way. It ended a loneliness I hadn't fully acknowledged, provided unwavering emotional support, offered the deep satisfaction of meaningful intimacy, and gave me someone to love and who loved me in return. It was everything I had hoped for, and more. There were a few challenges, naturally. Work often kept me stretched thin, which sometimes left Olivia frustrated with my availability. I suppose there were also a few habits of mine that she found irritating. On my end, there were things that bothered me too. Perhaps the main issue was the frequent socializing with her family, which wasn't exactly my preference. Let me clarify, I didn't dislike her family. They were decent, polite people without any glaring flaws in their personalities. It's just that I preferred not to spend excessive time with them. Her parents were friendly and welcoming, and they seemed to approve of me. But they had a tendency to give unsolicited advice on how we should live our lives and put some pressure on us to start a family. Thankfully, we weren't around them long enough for it to become too bothersome. Her younger sister Mindy and her husband posed a bit more of a challenge for me. Mindy resembled a shorter, slightly rounder version of Olivia, mimicking her style of dress and speech. Whenever Olivia was around, Mindy was invariably by her side, akin to virtual Siamese twins. They whispered conspiratorially, shared inside jokes, and shamelessly gossiped about friends and family. Since Mindy and her husband lived nearby, we ended up spending a considerable amount of time together. While there was nothing inherently wrong with this arrangement, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. When Olivia was with Mindy, it often felt like she wasn't truly present with me, which was quite frustrating. Adding to the complexity was Mindy's husband, Bruce. He was a tall, blonde, good-looking man who exuded friendliness and a laid-back demeanor, though I found him somewhat lacking in intellect. Bruce proudly managed his family's furniture store in Joliet, treating it as if it were a major corporation, despite its struggling performance. While I suspected Bruce himself might be part of the problem, I opted for peace, avoiding any confrontation that could upset Olivia. Thus, I spent many evenings nodding along as Bruce enthusiastically discussed his store, despite knowing its challenges. We had been married for almost 2 years when Olivia first approached me about helping Mindy and Bruce. She had prepared a fancy dinner with candles and mood music, dressed provocatively, leading me to initially think she was interested in an intimate evening together. Like any inexperienced husband, I assumed she wanted a passionate night with me. However, as the evening progressed, her true intentions became clear. She repeatedly mentioned how fortunate we were with our income and hinted at our ability to assist others. Finally, with a practiced look of concern, she confessed her worry about Mindy and Bruce, who were struggling financially. Bruce owed money and was having trouble making ends meet. Understanding where this was heading, I cut to the chase. "How much do they need, Liv?" She hesitated, clearly thrown off by my directness. After a moment of chewing her lip, she glanced shyly into my eyes. "They need $50,000 or $60,000 to get back on track." I was taken aback. While our business was thriving, most of my funds were tied up in a family trust, and this amount would significantly impact our available cash. Although I could withdraw money from the trust if necessary, I dreaded explaining this to Bernie Blackman, our primary business attorney who also managed the trust. He would comply with my request, but I knew he would closely monitor the repayment process for the foreseeable future. Bernie wasn't harsh, but he took his role in safeguarding the trust funds and our business very seriously. Considering all this, for one of the few times in our marriage, I hesitated to agree to Olivia's serious request. "I'm not sure, Liv, that's a substantial sum of money." She looked concerned. "Mindy says he has some excellent ideas and they'll repay it quickly. They're reliable for the money, if that's what worries you. I'm certain of that." Well, I had doubts about it. Actually, I was quite certain that sending the money to Bruce would be like throwing a substantial amount of cash down the drain. However, I wanted Olivia to be happy, so I decided to take the plunge and wrote a check for $60,000. I made it clear to Olivia that this meant we'd need to tighten our belts until the money returned. I had once heard advice that when you lend money to family, you should assume you'll never get it back. This prepared me emotionally, so that our relationship wouldn't sour if they didn't repay it. In my mind, this was more of a gift, a $60,000 gift to Olivia's sister and her rather inept brother-in-law. I didn't believe it would actually solve their problems because I knew he wasn't skilled enough in business to turn his store around, even with the cash. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I wanted to be seen favorably by Olivia and her family. I wanted them to like me, and I was willing to let go of $60,000 to achieve that. 3 or 4 months after I had lent Bruce the money, I was at home searching for a thumb drive that contained some important data. I had a bad habit of absent-mindedly placing important items in unusual spots. so I was basically scouring the entire house. After checking all the usual places, I wandered into the guest room, inspected the desk, and even looked under the bed. As I stood up, I noticed that the bed was unusually lumpy and in more disarray than my little search would have caused. It was clear that someone had slept in it and hastily pulled up the sheets and covers without properly making the bed. It didn't seem particularly important at the time, but later that evening, I casually mentioned it to Olivia. "Hey, was someone sleeping in the guest bed? I went in there earlier and it was pretty rumpled." Olivia started stammering and looked flushed and nervous. Well, I took a nap in there earlier. Sorry. I was doing some cleaning and got so exhausted I just jumped into the bed and didn't have a chance to clean it up." At that point in our marriage, I trusted Olivia completely, so it never crossed my mind that her explanation was anything but the truth. In fact, I remember thinking how funny it was that she would be nervous or embarrassed about needing to take a nap in the middle of the day. But the bedspread wasn't the only clue I missed. Over the next year or so, several other strange, inexplicable things happened that, if I hadn't been so oblivious, would have signaled that Olivia wasn't exactly a model of virtue. For instance, I unquestioningly accepted that her typically low-key job as an assistant manager at a small independent bookstore suddenly required her to attend an uninterrupted 5 or 6 hour meeting every Tuesday. This meeting was so important that I was not to contact her during that time at all. I also accepted every explanation for the little bruises that appeared on her body, some in quite intimate places, or the lingerie in the wash that I didn't remember her wearing. Then there was the matter of the orange juice. Olivia started shopping at a new upscale grocery store. On its own, this wasn't a big deal, except that she couldn't get a lot of the things I liked, including my favorite brand of orange juice. I complained and asked her to switch back, but she insisted the new store was better and far more convenient for her since it was right on the way home after her Tuesday meetings. Her choice of grocery stores might not seem like a significant indicator that she was cheating, but it became the piece of information that finally made me pause and think, ultimately leading to the epiphany that broke my heart. Less than 18 months after the initial loan, Olivia began suggesting that Bruce and Mindy might need more money. At this point, Bruce hadn't even repaid a small portion of the original $60,000, and I was very hesitant to provide additional funds, especially for a business I believed was unsustainable. I dismissed Olivia's suggestion, hoping she'd get the message and stop asking. However, she persisted, arguing that Mindy and Bruce might lose their business if they couldn't upgrade and acquire more inventory. Wanting to avoid outright refusal and still trying to maintain good relations, I agreed to review Bruce's business plan and visit his store to understand his plans. I hoped that by doing this, Olivia would drop the matter once it became clear that it was a poor investment. I met Bruce at his store on a Monday morning. With typical boundless enthusiasm, he showed me around, explaining the floor plan, introducing me to the employees, and treating me like his best friend whenever we stopped to talk to someone. He passionately discussed his business plan, confidently asserting that a bit more money for inventory improvements and a few upgrades would make the store significantly profitable in no time. Bruce and I sat down in his office for half an hour, and I shared my concerns. As diplomatically as possible, I indicated that I believed the business had significant problems. I suggested that unless he could streamline operations and reduce costs and prices, he was unlikely to increase customer interest and revenue, even with the changes he wanted to implement. I also gently proposed that he might consider selling the business and pursuing other opportunities, but he bristled at that and reiterated his belief that a simple facelift would suffice to turn things around. I didn't have the heart to outright deny his request for cash, so I explained that I didn't have enough personal funds to provide a substantial loan and that it would have to come from the trust. I told him I would talk to Bernie to see if he could approve the loan, but I couldn't guarantee anything. My plan was to avoid conflict and at least make it seem like I was making a genuine effort to secure the money before delivering the bad news and essentially blaming Bernie for the refusal. It was cowardly, I know. But I wanted to keep the peace in the family and wasn't willing to lose that much money. The truth was, Bernie would do pretty much anything I asked. But I always gave the impression that he was duty-bound to tightly manage the trust, and I couldn't override his decisions. It might seem unfair to cast Bernie as the bad guy, but honestly, I think he liked the role, and he never complained about it to me. At the end of our conversation, Bruce nodded and flashed a big, confident smile, giving me the impression that he felt optimistic about getting the loan. He gave me a firm handshake and another hearty pat on the back, which made me feel even guiltier as I left. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed for the freeway, reflecting on my meeting with Bruce and trying to mentally absolve myself of the cowardice and borderline dishonesty I'd just exhibited in his store. I was driving somewhat absent-mindedly when I saw something that initially seemed like an odd coincidence but gradually turned into a vaguely disturbing thought. It was a grocery store, smaller than most big chains, painted green, with a large sign out front that read, Salvadores. It was so distinctive that I was sure I had never seen one before, yet the name struck a familiar chord that I couldn't immediately place. I pondered it for a few minutes before it finally clicked. Salvadores was the store Olivia had started shopping at, the one that didn't stock my favorite orange juice but was so much easier to get to. This location wasn't anywhere near her work, our home, or any other place she would reasonably need to be during the week, so it didn't make any sense that this store was convenient for whatever she was doing on Tuesdays, unless, of course, her activities involved the furniture store itself. As I thought about it, some worrisome possibilities started to emerge. I made a U-turn and drove past Salvador's, then returned to Bruce's furniture store and parked there for a few minutes. I checked on my cell phone and confirmed that this was the only Salvador's in Chicago. For 15 or 20 minutes, I pondered all the possible reasons she might be shopping there. I considered that Olivia's work might have another office in the area, that she could be meeting Mindy for lunch, or that she might be going to a health club or something nearby. But my mind kept returning to the conclusion I didn't want to face. Suddenly, I felt an urgent need for more information and decided to confront Bruce directly. I jumped out of my car and walked briskly to the front door of the furniture store. The hours painted on the glass indicated the store was open until 8 p.m. on weekdays, except for Tuesdays when they closed at noon. The suspicion that had taken root minutes before continued to grow. Throwing the door open, I marched into the store and headed straight for the first employee I saw, a rather lazy middle-aged man stirring a cup of coffee. "Excuse me, but—" "Sorry, I'm on break right now," he interrupted testily. "Look, I don't want to take up much of your time, but I need to speak with Bruce McCoy immediately. I've been discussing some important financial matters with him and need more information." I looked at him expectantly, but he continued to stir his coffee and even took a sip without acknowledging my request. The reason they couldn't move merchandise was becoming clear. I waited a moment in stunned silence before speaking again, this time more insistently. Seriously, this is important. Can you get him for me?" He eyed me warily, but eventually a look of recognition came over his face. "You're the guy who was here earlier with Bruce, right? Hey, yeah, come on in. Bruce is meeting with a supplier right now, but you can wait in the break room for him if you want. He shouldn't be too long, maybe half an hour at most." He led me to the room at a leisurely pace and left me with a cup of coffee and the TV remote. I had a hastily devised plan to confront Bruce forcefully and bluff about having solid evidence that he and Olivia were cheating. I'd threatened that if he didn't come clean immediately, the evidence would go straight to Mindy and the rest of the family. I figured if Bruce was cheating with her, he'd break right away, and if he wasn't, I'd just have to live with the embarrassment. Maybe I'd play it off as a joke or something. I paced around the room, mentally rehearsing my speech, considering how I might claim to have pictures, recordings, or even say that Olivia had confessed. As I pondered the upcoming confrontation, I began to absent-mindedly scan the room. I flipped through some magazines and switched between TV channels before deciding to search for clues. It slowly dawned on me that if they were using the store for cheating, it would likely happen in this break room. And if so, They would almost certainly use the worn-out couch I was now staring at. For a moment I gazed at the couch with a mix of anger and apprehension. It was faded pea green with a couple of coffee stains and a tear in the fabric on one arm. It had clearly seen better days and belonged more in a junkyard or a second-hand store. I lifted a cushion, and my heart rate quickened when I saw it had a fold-out bed with sheets on it. I quickly checked to ensure Bruce was still in his office, then pulled out the bed. The sheets were in disarray, crumpled, with a couple of slightly darkened, yellowed areas where you could expect wet spots from proximity. There were also a couple of lipstick stains, and the bed faintly smelled of perfume. With the bed open, I noticed some debris on the floor under the couch. I extended my right arm into the space at the top of the bed, stretching and straining to reach the dirty carpet below, and pulled items up one by one. Eventually, I retrieved a pen, 37 cents in change, a crushed coffee cup, an empty tube of KY jelly, and a restaurant receipt. The receipt was from a Mexican place Olivia liked to go for lunch, and there at the bottom was her signature, flowing, elegant, and incriminating. Looking back, I realized that the receipt was just a flimsy piece of circumstantial evidence, something that could have been easily explained away with any number of stories or excuses. But somehow, finding it cleared the final fog from my mind, and all the nasty little oddities about her Tuesday meeting schedules, her bruises, her lingerie use, and the messed-up bed came together to form a clear picture of a cheating wife and a deceitful brother-in-law. Suddenly, my plan to intimidate Bruce into confessing seemed like a bad idea. I wanted clear-cut evidence of the affair, and recognized that a confrontation might jeopardize that, maybe make it impossible to prove. But now, knowing the probable time and place of their likely infidelity meant I could almost certainly gather the information, the evidence. I needed to be sure. I folded up the bed and sat on the couch, fuming, my heart racing and my teeth clenched. I'd been screwed over a few times in business deals and once cheated at cards, but I had never experienced a betrayal like this. I was on the verge of shouting, crying, screaming, and punching a hole in the wall all at once. But gradually, from this emotional whirlwind, one burning desire began to surface: the need to get even. I calmed down a bit and started assessing my situation, trying to think as detached and unemotionally as possible. I considered the vulnerabilities of Bruce and my wife, and how I could exploit those weaknesses to provide some satisfaction for my bruised ego once I had irrefutable proof. My first fantasy was to beat the crap out of Bruce, but that would only lead to jail time. My second thought was to refuse the loan and demand all my outstanding money back immediately. But I remembered something Bernie had once told me when I considered getting financing from a particularly aggressive bank. He advised against it, saying that if you owe someone money, especially someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart, they have you by the balls. I wanted to have Bruce by the balls. I glanced over at Bruce's office once more and saw him standing, shaking hands with the supplier. I waved, smiled, and he waved back before escorting the supplier to the door and hurrying back to the break room. "Hey, Mike, did you forget something? Need more info?" I shook my head, smiling. "Listen, Bruce, on second thought, I want to clarify something. I may have given the wrong impression earlier today. I really want you to know that I think highly of you as a businessman and believe this store is a winner. But as I drove away, I realized my question about your contingency plans might have come across differently than intended." He smiled in understanding. "No worries, Mike. Asking tough questions is part of the game." "Great. I just wanted to make sure you understand that I support what you're doing here. Your family, and I want to ensure this investment is not only safe but the right thing to do for you, both as a friend and a family member as well as a savvy businessman. I want you to know I'll be pushing hard to secure the funds. I'm confident we'll get them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have that kind of money in my personal accounts, so I'll need to request a withdrawal from the trust fund. But I'm almost certain I can persuade Bernie, and we'll get you the money." Bruce's eager smile widened as I spoke. "Wow, that sounds fantastic. he said. I'm telling you, this business is poised to take off any moment now, so that loan is as secure with me as it would be in a bank. You don't need to worry at all. I'm not concerned, Bruce. Bernie will need to draft some form of agreement, naturally, to protect the trust with collateral and such. I should have everything ready for your signature in a few days. Unless you object, you should have the cash within a week. The following morning, I entered Bernie's office and closed the door, sinking into a chair. Bernie was occupied on the phone, jotting down notes, and gestured with a raised finger, indicating he'd be free to talk soon. I shifted nervously as he wrapped up his call, and he gave me a questioning look when he hung up. So, Mike, what's got you on edge this morning? I cleared my throat and leaned forward slightly to speak. Bernie, I think I'll need to tap into the trust for a rather sizable loan. Yeah, well, that shouldn't pose a problem, I suppose. What kind of loan? And how much? He woke his computer with a click of his mouse and brought up a spreadsheet summarizing the trust's holdings. I cleared my throat again, leaning in closer. Listen, Bernie, before we get into the paperwork, I need absolute confidentiality from you first. Of course, No, listen. I need you to understand that this is unusual, and there might be a temptation to discuss this with Seth or someone else at work or in the family. I want only you and me to know exactly what I'm trying to accomplish here. He squirmed in his chair, furrowing his brow, and after a pause began cautiously. Mike, if this is something illegal. It's not illegal. Not at all. In fact, I need you to create a document that is absolutely foolproof in terms of legality. He tilted his head and I pressed on. I need to secure a loan. I need you to draft the loan documents. The terms of the loan must be crystal clear. The loan should be backed by the business itself that I intend to finance, and I want the consequences for non-payment to be explicitly stated. It sounds like you're anticipating a default, like you're setting a trap for someone, more or less. So, who are you trying to ensnare and why? I paused for a moment before meeting his gaze directly. I want to ensnare my brother-in-law, Bruce. And the reason is Olivia. He looked surprised, his eyebrows raising, and attempted to speak a couple of times before finally taking a sip of water from his desk and managing to say, Are you sure about this? Absolutely, I replied. Absolutely. Within a week, the document was prepared and I personally delivered it to Bruce for his review and signature. His lawyer, a small, timid man named Tim Sowers, who also happened to be his cousin, joined us to discuss the document. All right, Sowers began. I reviewed this last night and it mostly aligns with what I'd expect for a business-to-business loan. But there are a couple of points I'd like to highlight, Bruce, before you sign. Okay? Bruce, as usual, flashed his bland smile, appearing agreeable yet clueless. Sure, let me hear it, Tim. Sowers cleared his throat and scrutinized Bruce carefully, and I sensed a hint of disdain from him, as if he knew how little Bruce understood about business operations. All right, first off, this loan amount is $425,000 to be repaid over 7 years. The interest rate is fairly standard. Repayments start immediately, at a little over $6,000 per month. Bruce nodded along. Now, the actual disbursement you'll receive is $365,000, as we're consolidating it with your loan from a couple of years back. Mike will be reimbursed his $60,000, and you'll receive the remainder. Understand? Capisce? Bruce replied smugly with a slight Italian accent. Tim looked at him again and sighed quietly. All right then. The loan is secured, linked to your business, and also tied to a property near Keokuk. Is that the hunting land? Yeah, Bruce gestured to Bernie while speaking to Sowers. They, want to ensure Mike's trust is protected in case the business tanks. He grimaced briefly, then added quickly, But that won't happen. The business is in great shape. I believe so. Bernie Black thinks so. He nodded at me and smiled. And Mike certainly thinks so too. Right, Mike? Oh, absolutely, I replied enthusiastically. Bruce showed me the financials, and I think he's on to something good here. I smiled. But, Bernie is quite conservative and always plans for the worst-case scenario. He just wants to ensure the trust is secure, so he's keen on having a fallback in case, hypothetically, the business fails. Sowers frowned and turned to Bruce. Are you aware that defaulting could mean losing the business to the trust? Maybe even the hunting land that's been in the family. Sure, Bruce spoke earnestly, trying to convey to Sowers that he understood the gravity of the situation. I understand the implications, absolutely. But honestly, I'm confident in the business, and taking this loan feels safer than running without it. You also understand that penalties kick in after just 3 months of missed payments, right? Yes, I understand. Bruce smiled at me as if sharing a secret, as if he believed I wouldn't let Bernie enforce penalties except in extreme cases. I just smiled back. At home, Olivia was ecstatic. She couldn't stop talking about how Bruce's business would thrive now that he had the funds to address its major issues. I managed to refrain from saying what I desperately wanted to, that Bruce himself was the root of the problem, and no amount of money could solve that. Over the next few weeks, keeping quiet about Bruce's business skills was the least of my challenges around Olivia. I needed more details before I could end my marriage as planned, and that required time. So, I knew I had to control my emotions, which swung daily from sadness to anger to revulsion when I thought about her affair. Dining with her without erupting became a test, and intimacy was something to avoid altogether whenever possible. When I had no choice, I had to rely on the memories of the deplorable physical contact of the past years. When I turned 18, my friends and I went on a trip to San Diego for spring break. One evening we found ourselves in Tijuana, where we gave free rein to our feelings. We drank and watched some candid shows and ended up with girls of easy virtue. Somehow I ended up with a woman in her early 30s who clearly had a hard life experience. She wasn't particularly attractive, and in my drunken state, my idea of beauty was undoubtedly disrupted by a lot of alcohol. Despite the fact that I was very drunk, I had serious doubts about whether to go to bed with her, and I began to come up with excuses to avoid it. However, my friends teased me relentlessly, questioning my masculinity and orientation. Feeling pressured, I forced a smile, quickly drank more, gritted my teeth, and followed her upstairs to the dirty, poorly maintained room above the bar to continue. To get through this, I had to mentally detach myself from her presence, viewing her simply as a means to an end. So over the next few weeks, whenever I engaged in intimacy with Olivia, she once again became the embodiment of a woman in my thoughts. I closed my eyes, pulled away emotionally, and engaged in intimacy with her, as I had with another woman many years ago. There was no tenderness or emotional connection in it, just a mechanical action, no more important than relief. As expected, Olivia noticed the change and started talking about it, expressing a desire for us to be gentle and romantic when we are together. However, overall, she didn't seem to mind the rough treatment and even considered it an improvement over our previous contacts. I believe that in another scenario, she could thrive by serving American tourists in Tijuana. It was not as easy as expected to get irrefutable evidence of this connection. Bruce spent some of the money on repairing the store, which kept the workers busy all day. I correctly assumed that during this work the electrician I paid could have discreetly installed and then dismantled the camera and recording device in a pendant light above the sofa in the break room on Monday morning, about a month after Bruce received the money. Having a clear understanding of Bruce and Olivia's actions, I thought I was emotionally ready to watch the footage. I planned to sit in my office with a glass in my hand and watch the movie distantly, like in a movie. However, witnessing your wife dating another man is much more devastating than just knowing about their affair. Much, much worse. By the end of the recording, I had drunk so much scotch that I couldn't get home, trashed my desk, threw up twice, and even threw a paperweight at my office door. The video confirmed my suspicions. I quickly rewound the movie to Tuesday afternoon and watched at high speed until I noticed how a woman in a blue dress with a large bag abruptly entered the room, took fresh sheets out of the bag, and laid out the sofa. I slowed down the recording and sadly became convinced that this woman was indeed Olivia. After changing the sheets, she reopened the bag and retrieved a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Taking off her blue dress, she folded it neatly and put it in her bag before sitting on the edge of the bed. She passed the time reading a novel, creating a strangely surreal scene that reminded me of an eccentric performance art exhibition I once saw in New York. There, a scantily clad young woman read obscure New Age poetry to an audience more interested in her physical appearance than her words. When Bruce finally entered the room, Olivia set aside her book, smiled, and stood to greet him with a hug. Playfully pushing him away, she chided him for keeping her waiting. He teased back, joking about her inability to wait for anything, and they both laughed, sharing an old, familiar joke. They kissed for a few minutes and then started the main action. For them, it seemed like a routine. They silently waited for every move. When they finally finished, I was so hurt and angry that my breathing was heavier than theirs. I knew the images I had witnessed were seared into my mind like an unerasable scar, ensuring I could never forgive either of the 2 cheaters. I was relieved that I had a plan to end my marriage rather than salvage it. As I leaned forward to turn off the video, I noticed they had begun some intimate conversation. Olivia lay on her side, propped up by her right hand on her bent elbow, tracing lazy patterns on Bruce's chest as he lay on his back. They gazed at each other, softly, murmuring, smiling contentedly. Olivia playfully complained about using the furniture store as their love nest. Bruce rolled onto his side and replied, "Come on, Liv. If we book a hotel, it'll leave a trace for sure, and using either of our houses almost got us caught. We really don't have any other choice." Olivia shrugged. I know. But honestly, I wish we had another place to be together. I'm just not feeling this room, and changing last week's dirty sheets before making love isn't exactly romantic." Bruce reached out, gently stroking her cheek with a smile. "Well, we could always just run away together." Olivia laughed, and Bruce's expression turned contemplative, his smile fading slightly. "But seriously, Liv, do you ever regret marrying Mike? I mean, I love Mindy, and she's a good wife, but sometimes, I don't know. Do you think it would have been better if maybe you and I had gotten married instead?" Olivia sat up in bed, leaning against the headboard with her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked at Bruce thoughtfully before responding. "Come on, Bruce. How many times do we have to talk about this? What we have is special, very special. But no, I don't think it would have been better if we had gotten married instead. We would have been happy together, of course, but I love Mike, and you love Mindy. If you and I were together, it would just be us. Mike is very monogamous, and he would never have developed a relationship with me if I were married, and I don't think Mindy would appreciate that either." She leaned over, kissing Bruce on the cheek, and gently rubbing his chest with her right hand. "The truth is, Bruce, that people like us have a special capacity for love. We're capable of loving more than one person at a time, and we should love more than one person. It's natural for us. But Mindy and Mike aren't like that. Their preference for exclusivity means they could never understand what we do. They couldn't manage their emotions and satisfy everyone like we can." Hearing that, my anger boiled over, and that's when I hurled my paperweight through the office door. Because I loved her, and perhaps because she was the only woman who had ever loved me, I hadn't fully grasped how arrogant, delusional, and self-serving my wife had become. In her mind, she had somehow twisted her infidelity into a virtue. To her, it wasn't a betrayal of her husband, but rather something that contributed to love in the world. She believed not only that she had the right to do it, but also a moral obligation. That night, I slept on a couch in my office, and the next morning I completed all the necessary paperwork. When I arrived home the following evening, Olivia stood before me with her hands on her hips, wearing a stern expression. "Where were you last night?" she demanded. I was so worried. No call, no text? No hint of where you were? I silenced her with a raised hand. "I was at work. I ended up drinking too much to drive home, so I stayed there." She looked at me in utter confusion. Wait. What? You got drunk? At work? I smiled and nodded, and she pressed on. At the very least, you could have let me know what was happening. I was about to call the police, and why were you drinking at work? Her glare persisted, mingled with genuine bewilderment. Without answering, I walked past her into the living room, collapsed onto the sofa, put my feet up on the coffee table, put my briefcase on my lap, and opened it. Olivia sighed in exasperation and followed me into the living room, angrily sitting down in an armchair opposite the sofa. Hey, how about answering some questions, Mike? Why did you get so drunk at work? What happened last night? What's going on? I continued rummaging through my briefcase, pulled out a couple of folders, and put them one by one on the couch next to me. Wait a minute, Liv. I want to clean up a little bit. I sorted through the papers, took my feet off the table, and leaned forward to put them back in place. Rubbing my hands together as if preparing for a feast, I looked at Olivia and smiled. Okay, then let's get started. What? Start? Yeah, well, after what happened last night. Last night? What happened last night? Olivia's aggressive behavior upon my arrival home was quickly replaced by something more passive. I started to feel a little scared. Could you at least tell me what you were doing last night? Oh, yes, I watched the video. Yes, I watched the video of you and Bruce getting intimate on the couch in his break room, and it seemed a little disturbing to me, so I probably ended up drinking too much. You understand? I returned a thin, emotionless smile to Olivia, whose expression had shifted from confusion to distress, then to shock, fear, and bewilderment. Her mouth hung half open, making sporadic movements without producing any coherent sound. Her eyes, moist and growing wetter, darted between the papers on the table, the door, and me, as if anticipating someone or something to enter, sweep up the papers, and rectify everything. Finally, she spoke. I don't understand, Mike. What are you talking about? Come on, Olivia, you can't be that oblivious. I'm talking about you and Bruce and what you've been doing every other damn Tuesday for at least a year. I gestured towards the paperwork in front of me. I'm talking about the end of our marriage. Olivia gasped suddenly and covered her mouth with her hand momentarily. I waited for her response. Mike, we can figure this out. I believe I can make you understand. Oh, I think I understand, Liv. I pulled a DVD from my briefcase, briefly held it up, and then slid it across the table towards her. I gathered quite a bit of information last night that shed light on things. Quite a treasure trove of new facts about my loving wife and my dear brother-in-law. She regarded the DVD as though it were a venomous snake, visibly recoiling and showing no intention of picking it up. Go ahead, Liv. It's your copy. I won't reveal how I acquired it, but I have my own for future reference and to better understand your views on love and devotion. She leaned forward as if to approach me, but I raised my hand to halt her, and she remained seated. After biting her lip momentarily, she looked directly at me and began speaking again, slowly and deliberately, attempting to mask the uncertainty in her voice with false confidence. Mike, you need to open your mind and consider this. It doesn't make sense for you to jeopardize our lives because we have different values and abilities. I love you and have always been willing to accommodate our differences, hoping that... I cut her off with a derisive snort. Different values and abilities. Seriously? You think cheating on your husband is some kind of ability? Because, Liv, I'm pretty sure anyone can do that, honestly. Ability is the wrong word, she replied, taking a deep breath and briefly looking up at the ceiling before meeting my gaze again. Capacity. I think capacity is the right word. I have a deep capacity for love, and I can, and have, loved more than one person romantically at the same time. Aside from outdated norms about love and relationships, there's no reason I can't exercise my capacity. Please, just stop. Your excuses make me sick. I understand, I got it from the tape, that you think you have some special ability that allows you to cheat, lie, and have affairs, when you should be faithful. But it's just a lame excuse, Liv. Anyone can have romantic entanglements with multiple people at once. It doesn't make them lovers with a greater capacity. It just makes them cheaters. With a sudden change, Olivia, who had been apologetic and conciliatory, disappeared. In her place stood an angry, aggressive, and supremely self-confident woman. "You're calling me a cheater?" she spat at me. "Well, from your perspective, maybe I am. But let me tell you, I've never betrayed my love for you or for Bruce. I refuse to compromise my emotions or my actions just to fit some outdated code that demands I restrict myself to one person. So, yes, you might see me as a cheater, but when I look in the mirror, I have no doubts about who I am or what I've done." Her breath was heavy with passion. Her face and chest flushed, fire blazing in her eyes. A challenge daring me to oppose her. And so I did. Do you want to live like that? Some kind of open relationship with many different men, loving one today and another tomorrow? Fine, go ahead. Everyone has their own choices. But it's completely dishonest to act like you haven't betrayed me, haven't been deceitful. You never once mentioned to me that you were with Bruce, knowing full well I wouldn't have accepted it. You know that. She could sense my intensity as she turned her head away slightly, avoiding my eyes. I adjusted so our gazes locked, and I continued. So instead, you chose to deceive through omission, the most significant omission of truth I've ever faced personally. You led me, and almost everyone else, to believe we were a committed, exclusive couple. Meanwhile, you were seeing Bruce, hiding your encounters as best as possible. You lived a lie, and no matter what unconventional relationship philosophy you adhere to, that still makes you unfaithful. Angry tears streamed down her cheeks now, her mouth tightly clenched. Her expression was more furious than sorrowful, shaking her head slowly in disagreement with my words. Yet she seemed unable to articulate her feelings. I kept my gaze fixed on her, waiting for a response that never came. Finally, I broke the silence by pushing the paperwork closer to her. "Read it. Get a lawyer. It's fair." At last, she spoke. "And if I don't want a divorce?" "Then you're out of luck, Liv, because you're getting one." I paused briefly, a smirk barely concealed. "But hey, it's not like you'll be alone." That night I moved out, finding an apartment closer to work, quickly reverting to who I was before Olivia. A worker, a businessman, a loner with no time or desire for socializing. The hours at work became unbearable, and many noticed. Yet staying home meant obsessing over Olivia, replaying her affair in my mind, wondering if she thought of me or if she was with Bruce. I had no choice but to throw myself into work, trying to move past my failed marriage as swiftly as possible. In any competition, my usual tendency is to do whatever it takes to win. Most people who knew me in the business world would have expected a prolonged, aggressive negotiation to settle disputes. However, I wanted to avoid delay, conflict, and pain, so I was willing to pay a substantial lump sum to Olivia instead of ongoing support, with a warning that I would withdraw the offer if she didn't agree to a quick divorce. Part of me hoped she would resist, insist on trying to salvage our marriage, decline the offer, and fight for our relationship. I wanted her to prioritize the slim chance she saw for our marriage over money. Ultimately, she didn't. With some hesitant objections, she accepted the terms, and 60 days later, our marriage was over. After Bruce's divorce was finalized, it didn't take long for him to start missing payments. Despite receiving warnings and a stern letter from Bernie informing him that we would begin enforcing payment however necessary, Bruce persisted in making excuses and pleading for more time. I instructed Bernie to take a tough stance, emphasizing that we would exercise our legal rights to seize collateral at the earliest opportunity. As we approached a workout session, Bruce pleaded to meet with me personally, sensing his desperation had peaked. and he was willing to do anything to avoid financial trouble. I anticipated Olivia would be the source of the money. I eagerly awaited our meeting. We met after hours in my office, with most of the staff having left for the day. Sherry, my personal assistant, remained in the outer office, prepared to handle paperwork if needed. Bruce appeared noticeably nervous, offering a clammy handshake as he cautiously entered. Standing slightly behind him, almost timidly, was Olivia, whose presence momentarily caught my breath. Olivia positioned herself closer to me than to Bruce, dressed impeccably with makeup done and a radiant smile, leaving little doubt she was there to leverage our past emotional connections in Bruce's favor. Suddenly, a strong urge swept over me to rush to her, embrace her, and kiss her passionately. But aware of the peril in my emotions, I forcefully suppressed the impulse. Instead, I grimaced and grunted a reluctant greeting to acknowledge her presence. I was genuinely surprised that she had shown up at all. I'd been anticipating this meeting for a long time, envisioning how it would unfold. However, I hadn't expected Olivia to be there, fearing her presence might disrupt my carefully planned strategy to expose her lover's shortcomings. I briefly considered objecting, perhaps suggesting she wait outside, but ultimately concluded that her presence might add to the satisfaction of the outcome. Bruce attempted to charm me from the outset. After shaking my hand, he smiled warmly and engaged in small talk about making amends, wanting my happiness, and expressing his respect. He seemed apologetic for how things had turned out, implying a desire to rebuild some sort of friendship. I remained skeptical. Without a hint of a smile, I stared him down and interrupted his speech bluntly. "Bruce, please, stop with the nonsense. Your apologies mean nothing to me, all right?" He recoiled in his chair, his expression as though I had struck him. After a deep, anxious breath, he nodded in resignation before starting again. "Okay, sorry, Mike. Let's focus on business." He looked at me expectantly, as if the meeting were mine to lead. I simply gestured with my hands, waiting for him to present his case. He nervously licked his lips and ran a trembling hand through his hair before launching into an explanation. He insisted he fully intended to repay the money, but admitted he was currently short on funds. He described Bernie's tough tactics and expressed doubts about whether I understood the pressure he was under to pay. He then shifted to talk about the business's imminent recovery, claiming that a bit more time would allow him to stabilize financially. Finally, he argued that granting him an extension would ultimately benefit me financially. I leaned back in my chair, studying Bruce carefully, as he nervously smiled, sweat forming on his forehead and his hand trembling on the table between us. "Bruce, if you weren't such a blatant liar, I might consider extending the deadline." His eyes widened in surprise and distress, leaning forward to protest. But I stopped him with a raised hand. "Let's face it, Bruce. It's hard to trust someone who had no qualms about betraying his own family by having an affair with his sister-in-law. Asking her husband for a financial favor is beyond absurd." Bruce squirmed uncomfortably in his chair, while Olivia cleared her throat nervously and intervened with a pleading tone. "Mike, please, you can't punish Bruce because—" "I can do whatever I damn well please, Olivia," I snapped, shooting her a look of pure hostility. "And why are you even here?" "I thought maybe I could appeal to you, Croido, for old time's sake. I still care about you, and I thought that—" I cut her off abruptly and loudly. "You thought wrong. Frankly, your presence only reminds me of how Bruce here betrayed me by getting involved with you. So do yourself and Bruce a favor, sit back, look pretty, and keep quiet." Tears welled in her eyes and her chin quivered, but she complied, sinking back in her chair quietly. I turned back to Bruce. "All right, Bruce. Here's how it's going to be. You'll repay on time, strictly as scheduled, or I'll initiate procedures to recover what I can from the collateral." Bruce shook his head vigorously. "Come on, Mike. You can't destroy my business. You can't—" "I am fully capable and determined to act, Bruce, if you fail to pay. My suggestion is to gather the funds. Consider your family, explore banking options, sell assets, whatever it takes. Obtain the money or face the consequences. But, You know the banks won't lend to me or I would have approached them first. And my family, they can't assist. They don't have that kind of money. I fixed Bruce with a direct stare. Don't try to tell me your family is broke. I know they're not. No, they aren't. They would help if they could, but they simply can't. What about her? I nodded towards Olivia. Have you asked her for money? Bruce leaned back. Liv? Liv doesn't... I chuckled. Of course she does. I wrote her a check for $150,000. She's well off, aren't you, Olivia? I glanced at Olivia with a smirk, and Bruce turned to her with a puzzled expression. Clearly, he wasn't aware of the substantial payment. She appeared suddenly anxious, perhaps a bit queasy. Well, yes, I do, but I need that money. I chuckled again. Hold on there, Liv. Remember how confident you were in Bruce's ability to manage money when you convinced me to assist in the first place? Why hesitate now? If you think it's a wise investment for me, shouldn't it be for you too? I gave her an expectant, menacing grin. She swallowed hard, glanced at Bruce briefly, then back at me. After taking a deep breath, she straightened her posture and, with a somewhat defiant tone, declared that she could manage to cover the shortfall for a while. Bruce smiled at her, and she returned a weak smile before they departed. Bruce walked with a newfound confidence while Olivia's shoulders slumped in disappointment. As I held the door open for them, I gave them one final warning. Remember, Bruce, I don't care how. I just want the money. You'll get your money, he retorted sharply. Olivia appeared visibly concerned. Over the following months, I sought refuge in my work. I maintained a professional demeanor, interacting efficiently with others while steadfastly avoiding personal conversations and social engagements. I preferred solitude or focusing on tasks, attempting to keep thoughts of my wife's betrayal at bay. However, reminders of her persisted, including the monthly check from Bruce that arrived on my desk. Receiving it brought a bitter satisfaction, as it seemed to bring those responsible for my unhappiness down into misery alongside me. Things took a turn for the worse when Mindy reached out to me. She emailed and called, revealing that Bruce and Olivia had confessed their affair to her, though likely in a softened manner, and that she had initially struggled but eventually forgiven them. To my dismay, she hinted that she had suspected their relationship and implied they had an arrangement to continue seeing each other. She even tentatively suggested I reconsider taking Olivia back. My responses to her were sharp and filled with bitterness, and I left her in tears after our second call. After that, I heard nothing more from her. Mindy's apparent acceptance indicated that Bruce and Olivia's emotional burden was much lighter than I had anticipated. My deepest concern then was that the business would somehow recover. Bruce would settle his debts, reimburse Olivia, and they would all find financial and emotional satisfaction. They might then leave me behind, pitying the fool who couldn't grasp the complexities of modern love. As it turned out, I had no reason to worry. The furniture warehouse burned down 9 months after my meeting with Bruce and Olivia. The fire was a dramatic incident that triggered a 2-alarm response, threatening nearby buildings and making headlines. Although I hadn't seen the news, Bernie had, and he immediately called me to express his anger over the risk I had taken. He was convinced that the trust had lost a significant amount of money. I reassured him by promising to personally cover the loan liability in case of default, emphasizing that the properties still held value due to their prime location. Questions arose about the fire, especially when accelerants were found, leading the insurance company to hesitate on payouts. With no income from the store, Bruce defaulted on the loan, leaving me with a charred lot and 35 acres of duck hunting land along the Mississippi. The criminal investigation continued for nearly 6 months. Detectives built a circumstantial case against Bruce and Olivia, showing the store was losing money and Olivia was injecting increasingly large sums to sustain it. Bruce had unsuccessfully sought loans elsewhere and, as a last resort, attempted to sell the business at a steep discount, but found no buyers. The investigators were unable to find evidence placing Olivia or Bruce near the store on the night of the fire, or showing they obtained any materials to ignite or intensify it. However, their case centered around the suspicion that they had hired a professional to set fire to the store. They discovered multiple searches for arson on Olivia's home computer, phone records indicating communication with at least 2 men previously convicted of arson, and noted that she had withdrawn $15,000 in cash 1 week before the fire occurred. Olivia and Bruce were well represented, likely funded by whatever money Olivia had left. The district attorney anticipated a tough battle, prompting early negotiations. Initially facing first-degree arson and fraud charges, they bargained down from there. The defense stood firm, settling only on 4th-degree arson, setting the stage for a standoff until the trial date. I waited on the witness list, seated in the courthouse foyer, on what was supposed to be the trial's first day. Perched on a hard wooden bench, I passed the time with a newspaper, absent-mindedly tapping my foot on the tiled floor. Suddenly, a court official emerged and announced the trial's cancellation. They had struck a deal and we were free to leave. As I gathered my belongings, Olivia and Bruce entered the room escorted by officers and their lawyer. Reporters sprang up, thrusting microphones towards them, but they declined to comment, directing questions to their attorney instead. Bruce met Mindy and left with some officers while Olivia glanced my way and boldly approached to chat. I admired her courage in facing me. "Well, Mike, is this your happy day? Is this what you wanted for me to pay for my mistakes?" I chuckled bitterly and shook my head. All I wanted was a faithful wife and a successful marriage. Clearly that was too much to ask from you, and failing that, at least my money, she sneered. "Well, you're not getting any of that now, are you?" "Oh, I've reclaimed some of it, and I have the store," she laughed. "And what will you do with that? Has it stopped burning yet?" You'd be surprised what a skilled businessman can achieve with valuable property, even one that's been damaged. Her nostrils flared and her expression hardened slightly. She took a deep breath and paused before speaking again. "And are you happier now? Alone? Without anyone? Devoted to your work indefinitely?" She smirked knowingly. "Don't deny it, I know you. I know how much you dislike socializing and meeting new people. I'm working on it, Liv. I loved you, but there are other women out there." She smiled confidently. "Yes, there are. But I doubt you'll find what do you business types call it? A suitable replacement? Whether you like it or not, you'll miss me." I leaned in close and whispered in her ear. "I might be a bit lonely, but you won't be, will you? The good news is you'll be surrounded by plenty of like-minded women to share your abundant affection with. It's a win-win for you and the Dykes." Olivia startled me with a sudden loss of composure in response to my last comment. She recoiled as if I were radioactive, her face a mask of contempt, her eyes flashing with anger. Taking a deep breath, she heaved her chest aggressively a couple of times before erupting. "You bigoted, self-centered, emotionally retarded jerk," she screamed as officers escorted her towards the door. "You're going to end up in a shithole just like me. Alone with no one. Married to your damn job." As I watched her yelling, realizing that her love for me had completely vanished, replaced by a contemptuous hatred, a wave of sadness washed over me. I resisted the urge to react, visibly hurt, managed a thin smile, and muttered some remark about her colorful language in public. But she continued her tirade as though I hadn't spoken. "But soon enough I'll be out of my prison and moving on while you'll still be alone, wishing you could be with me. And then, years from now, when you're married to some boring former secretary, you'll still wish you had just accepted." The door closed behind her, cutting off the rest of her rant abruptly. I turned and walked out of the courtroom. My afternoon had been freed up for the trial, so with no other commitments or meetings and battling a mounting feeling of sadness and isolation, I headed to the charred lot and reflected on my life. The temperature plummeted and the wind relentlessly whipped at my jacket, stinging my face as I surveyed the scene, still pondering how to handle the wreckage. Uncertain if I could salvage anything from the situation, my primary urge was to sell it all off, bury the loss, and focus on familiar pursuits. It seemed like the safe choice, perhaps even the wise one. But I knew there was an alternative. I could take a chance and start over, perhaps even opening another furniture store. I pondered the idea of successfully selling furniture from the very location where Bruce had failed. I thought about making a splash with extensive advertising, billboards, maybe even TV commercials, things that Bruce and my ex couldn't ignore. Just to make a point, I might even name it Olivia's and host numerous fire sales. It occurred to me that the decisions I faced regarding the property mirrored those I had unconsciously made about my life in general. Olivia had been right about me. My natural inclination, and really my only social tendency before meeting her, was to withdraw, avoiding the risks of close relationships and focusing on work. I could see myself drifting towards a solitary life, financially secure, but lacking in joy. I was reverting to what I knew best, choosing the safe path. I sat on a concrete block and surveyed my surroundings once more, weighing my options and contemplating my future. I found myself caught between my fears and desires, between ingrained habits that had defined me and the longing for change, for something different. I was on the verge of leaving to return to work, postponing the decision for another day when a few rays of late afternoon sun filtered through the clouds and buildings, illuminating a graffiti-covered wall across the street. The sunlight cast a burnt orange glow, giving a radiant quality to the concrete and the bold, white letters. The words were clear and easily readable. Go for it. I had always been skeptical of superstitious beliefs, dismissing the way people let insignificant things dictate their lives as signs or rituals. But there, sitting on a cold slab of concrete in November, those words felt like destiny, as if they were a message from a higher power. I took out my cell phone and called the office, reaching my assistant. Hey, Sherry, do you know the architecture firm behind the new mall with all the glass and fountains that's been in the news? I think it's something like Hammerstone, I think. They're based here in Chicago. All right, can you arrange a meeting with them as soon as possible? She hesitated. Are we planning to build something? I surveyed the lot, envisioning the new store, and suddenly felt a surge of confidence. Yes, I think I am. Okay. Sure, boss. Anything else? I chewed my lip, my gaze returning to the graffiti across the street, reaffirming the directive to go for it. Hey, yeah, Sherry, there's something else. You know that sales representative for the imitation jeans, the tall blonde, Brenda? Brenda White, I believe. Yes. Sherry's voice was growing more incredulous, and I started to wonder if she thought I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. Could you obtain her contact information for me? Sure, boss. Do you want me to connect you with her? No, I'll make the call myself, thanks.